In 1861, on the third Thursday of November, in the heart of Warren County, Mississippi, a woman named Sarah took an axe and dismembered her master and his three brothers as they slept off their Thanksgiving feast. The bodies were discovered at dawn by the house servants, arranged in the dining room where the family had celebrated just hours before. This is the story of how the institution of slavery could transform a human soul into an instrument of such calculated vengeance that even the hardened planters of the Delta fell silent when they heard her name. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South, the ones that reveal not just the brutality of the system, but the psychological warfare it waged on every person it touched. The Hartwell Plantation sat on 1,200 acres of prime bottomland along the Mississippi River, just south of Vicksburg, where the soil ran black and rich enough to make cotton grow as tall as a man's shoulder. Colonel Thaddeus Hartwell had inherited the property from his father in 1847, along with 163 enslaved men, women, and children, whose names were listed in a ledger book kept in his study, each entry noting their age, their skills, their monetary value, and in some cases their lineage back through 3 generations of bondage on Hartwell land. By 1861, that number had grown to 207, making Hartwell one of the wealthiest men in the county, a position he maintained through calculated cruelty disguised as paternalistic care. He was 43 years old that November, a graduate of the College of William and Mary, a deacon at First Presbyterian Church of Vicksburg, and a man who genuinely believed that slavery was ordained by God and beneficial to the African race, which he considered incapable of self-governance. He had buried 2 wives already, both dead in childbirth, and lived alone in the great house with his 3 younger brothers, who helped him manage the plantation and shared his convictions about the natural order of the races. Sarah was 26 years old in the autumn of 1861, though she had been born on the Hartwell plantation and had never known any other home. She was the daughter of a woman named Dinah, who had died of fever when Sarah was 9, and a father whose identity was never spoken aloud, but understood by everyone who saw Sarah's light brown skin and hazel eyes. She could read, having been taught secretly by the colonel's first wife, who had harbored abolitionist sympathies despite her Mississippi birth, and had paid for that transgression with isolation and, some whispered, with her life. Sarah worked in the great house as a lady's maid, though there was no lady to attend after the second wife died, and her duties had expanded to include cooking, cleaning, and managing the other house servants. She was known for her silence, for the way she moved through rooms like a ghost, for the intelligence that burned behind her eyes and terrified the white men who noticed it. Colonel Hartwell had noticed it. He had noticed everything about Sarah since she turned 16, and what followed was not romance or even lust in any conventional sense, but the exercise of absolute power that the institution of slavery made possible and, in the minds of men like Hartwell, inevitable. The household that November included 8 enslaved people who worked in the great house itself, each of them intimately aware of the dynamics that governed their existence. There was Moses, 61 years old, the butler who had served the Hartwell family since before Thaddeus was born, his back bent from decades of deference, his face a mask that revealed nothing. There was Celia, 38. The cook whose hands trembled when the colonel entered her kitchen, who had borne him 2 children who were sold downriver before they learned to walk. There was young Thomas, 19, who worked the stables and dreamed of running north, though he had never spoken that dream aloud. There was Patience, 15, recently brought into the house from the fields, still learning to navigate the particular horrors of domestic service. There was Ruth, 45, the laundress whose daughter had been Sarah's childhood friend, until that daughter vanished one night and was never mentioned again. There was Samuel, 12, who carried water and firewood and watched everything with eyes that had already seen too much. There was Esther, 53, who tended the garden and knew the properties of every plant that grew in Mississippi soil, including those that could heal and those that could kill. And there was Sarah, who moved among them like a queen in exile, saying little but missing nothing, the one person in that house who refused to let her spirit be entirely broken, even as her body was used as property. The conflict that would culminate in blood and axes began not with a single event, but with an accumulation of violations that stretched back years, each one documented in the silent ledger of Sarah's memory. But the immediate trigger came in late October 1861, when Colonel Hartwell announced to his brothers that he intended to sell Sarah to a cotton broker in New Orleans, who had expressed interest in acquiring what he called a refined mulatto woman for domestic service. The sale was scheduled for December, after the harvest was complete. Hartwell's brothers, James, Robert, and William, ranging in age from 37 to 40, had initially supported the decision. Sarah had become, in their estimation, too proud, too aware of her own intelligence, too dangerous to keep in the house now that war had begun, and slaves across the South were whispering about liberation. But James, the eldest brother, had his own designs on Sarah, and he argued against the sale with increasing vehemence as November approached. The arguments between the brothers grew heated, conducted in the study over whiskey, while Sarah served them in silence, absorbing every word, every threat, every casual discussion of her future, as though she were livestock to be traded at market. On the evening of November 10th, James Hartwell came to Sarah's cabin, the small wooden structure behind the great house where she slept alone, a privilege granted because of her position and because the colonel wanted her available at any hour. James was drunk and furious from another argument with Thaddeus, and he forced himself on Sarah with a violence that left her bleeding and barely conscious. He whispered that if his brother sold her to New Orleans, he would make sure she went to the worst brothel in the French Quarter, where women like her were used until they died. When he left, Sarah lay on the floor of her cabin for 3 hours, unable to move, staring at the ceiling and feeling something fundamental shift inside her soul. It was not hatred that she felt in that moment, though hatred was certainly present. It was clarity, a cold, perfect understanding that she was going to kill them all, and that she would do it in a way that ensured they understood, in their final moments, exactly who had taken their lives and why. Pause here and reflect on the psychological transformation that slavery demanded of its victims. Sarah was not born violent. She was not inherently vengeful. She had, by all accounts, tried to survive with dignity within a system designed to strip dignity away. But when every legal protection is removed, when every human right is denied, when even your own body is not your own, the soul makes calculations that free people cannot comprehend. The question is not why Sarah did what she did. The question is how any person in her position maintained sanity at all. Sarah spent 2 weeks planning the murders with the same meticulous care that Colonel Hartwell applied to managing his plantation. She observed the brothers' routines, noting when they retired to bed, how much they drank, where they kept their firearms. She spoke quietly to Esther about plants that grew along the riverbank, plants whose names she would not mention aloud, but whose properties she came to understand. She noted that Thanksgiving would be the perfect night, when the brothers would feast until they could barely move, when they would drink enough whiskey to ensure deep sleep, when the other servants would be exhausted from preparing the meal, and would not stir until dawn. She calculated that she would have approximately 5 hours between midnight and sunrise to complete her work, and she planned every minute with cold precision. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were marked by an eerie normalcy that several survivors would later describe as unsettling. Sarah performed her duties without complaint, her face revealing nothing of the storm that raged inside her. She helped Celia prepare the Thanksgiving feast, a massive undertaking that included 2 turkeys, a ham, cornbread dressing, sweet potatoes, collard greens, biscuits, and 3 different pies. She set the table in the formal dining room with the Hartwell family silver, polished until it gleamed in the candlelight. She served the brothers their meal with the same silent efficiency she had always displayed, refilling their glasses, clearing their plates, standing in the corner of the room like a piece of furniture while they laughed and toasted the Confederacy and discussed the war news from Virginia. They were in high spirits that evening. The harvest had been exceptional. The war seemed to be going well for the South. They had much to be thankful for, they said, raising their glasses to the peculiar institution that made their wealth possible. By 10 o'clock, the brothers had retired to the study for cigars and brandy. By 11, they had stumbled upstairs to their bedrooms, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. Sarah waited in the kitchen with Celia and Moses, the three of them cleaning the dishes in silence. At 11:30, Moses and Celia retreated to their quarters behind the kitchen. Sarah told them she would finish the cleaning and bank the fires. They did not question her. They had learned long ago not to question anything. At midnight, Sarah stood alone in the kitchen of the great house, listening to the silence, feeling her heart beat steady and slow in her chest. She had hidden the axe 3 days earlier, a heavy wood-cutting implement that she had sharpened herself on the grinding wheel behind the stable. She retrieved it now from where it lay, wrapped in burlap beneath the kitchen stairs, and she began to climb toward the second floor, where the brothers slept. The historical record does not contain detailed descriptions of what happened in those rooms, and that is perhaps a mercy. What is known comes from the testimony given at the inquest held 2 days later, testimony provided primarily by Moses and Thomas, who discovered the scene at dawn. Colonel Thaddeus Hartwell was found in his bed, though the bed was barely recognizable as such, the violence having been so extreme that the coroner could not provide an accurate count of the wounds. James Hartwell was found in his room, in a similar condition. Robert and William had apparently woken and tried to defend themselves, their bodies discovered near their bedroom doors, suggesting they had at least managed to rise before Sarah reached them. The axe was found in the dining room, placed carefully on the table where the Thanksgiving feast had been served, surrounded by pieces of the brothers arranged with what witnesses described as deliberate symbolism, though they would not elaborate on what that symbolism might have been. Sarah herself was found sitting in Colonel Hartwell's study, in his leather chair, wearing one of his wife's old dresses that she had taken from storage, reading a book by lamplight, as though nothing had happened. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten histories, these stories that reveal the true cost of slavery, and the depths of human suffering it created, I invite you to subscribe to Shadows of the South, where we continue to excavate the past with honesty and respect for those whose voices were silenced by history. When Thomas opened the study door and saw Sarah sitting there, he did not immediately understand what had happened. He asked her why she was awake so early, why she was in the master's chair. Sarah looked up from her book and told him, in a calm voice that Thomas would never forget, that the colonel and his brothers were dead upstairs, that she had killed them, and that he should fetch the sheriff from Vicksburg before the other servants discovered the bodies. Thomas stood frozen for perhaps 30 seconds, his mind unable to process what he was hearing, and then he ran. He ran through the house screaming, waking everyone, and within minutes the plantation was in chaos. Moses tried to enter Colonel Hartwell's room and immediately retreated, his face gray. Celia began to wail, not from grief for the dead men, but from terror of what would happen next. Patience fainted. Samuel climbed a tree and refused to come down. Ruth simply stood in the yard, her hands over her mouth, staring at the great house, as though it might collapse at any moment. Sarah did not run. She did not resist when Moses, acting on some deeply ingrained instinct to maintain order, took her arm and led her to the root cellar and locked her inside. She sat in the darkness among the stored vegetables and preserved fruits, waiting for what she knew was coming. She could hear the commotion above, the sound of horses arriving, men's voices raised in shock and anger. She could hear the other slaves being questioned, their terrified voices insisting they knew nothing, they had heard nothing, they had been asleep. By mid-morning, the cellar door opened and Sheriff John Clayton stood looking down at her, his face pale, his hand on his pistol. He asked her if she had killed the Hartwell brothers. She said yes. He asked her why. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Because I could." He ordered his deputies to bind her hands and take her to the jail in Vicksburg, and as they led her out of the cellar into the bright November morning, every enslaved person on the Hartwell plantation stood watching in silence, their faces revealing nothing of what they felt. The inquest was held on November 30th in the Warren County Courthouse, a formality required by law, even though the outcome was never in doubt. Sarah was not permitted legal representation, as enslaved people had no standing in Mississippi courts. She was not allowed to testify on her own behalf. The proceedings consisted primarily of white men describing the scene they had witnessed and expressing their horror at the depravity of which the African race was capable when discipline was relaxed. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, who had examined the bodies, testified that the violence demonstrated a level of savagery beyond comprehension, though he notably did not mention the scars he had found on Sarah's body during his examination, scars that told their own story of sustained brutality. Moses was forced to testify, and under oath stated that Sarah had always been obedient and quiet, that he had never known her to be violent, that he could offer no explanation for her actions. He was asked directly if Colonel Hartwell had ever mistreated Sarah in any way. Moses looked at the all-white jury, at the packed courtroom filled with planters who owned human beings just as Hartwell had, and he said no, the colonel had been a kind master. The spectators nodded with satisfaction. The jury deliberated for 11 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Henry Tarleton, a plantation owner himself, who had known the Hartwell family for decades, sentenced Sarah to death by hanging, to be carried out on December 7th. He added that her body would not be released for burial, but would be dissected at the Medical College of Mississippi for the advancement of anatomical science, a common fate for executed slaves, whose bodies were considered to have some final use even in death. When he asked Sarah if she had anything to say before sentence was passed, she looked directly at him and said, "Every person in this room knows why I did what I did, and you will all burn in hell for pretending you don't." The courtroom erupted. Judge Tarleton ordered her removed immediately, and she was dragged back to her cell, while the white citizens of Vicksburg shouted their outrage at her impudence. In the days between her sentencing and her execution, Sarah received visitors, though not the kind one might expect. Several plantation owners came to her cell, ostensibly to question her about whether she had conspired with other slaves, whether there was a broader plot to murder white families across the county. In reality, they came because they were terrified. Sarah's act of violence had exposed the lie at the heart of the slave system, the pretense that enslaved people accepted their bondage, that they were content in their servitude, that the relationship between master and slave was one of mutual benefit and even affection. Every planter who looked at Sarah saw the reflection of his own slaves, saw the hatred that might be hidden behind their deferential faces, saw the potential for vengeance that existed in every cabin on their properties. They needed her to be insane, to be an aberration, to be something other than what she actually was, a rational human being who had calculated the cost of her freedom and found it acceptable. Pause and consider the mathematics of slavery, the equation that bound 4 million people in chains. The system functioned on the assumption that the enslaved would never rise up, that the violence inflicted on them daily would be endured without retaliation, that the threat of greater violence would be sufficient to maintain order. But every system has its breaking point, every human soul has its limit, and men like Colonel Hartwell gambled every day that they would never find where that limit lay. Sarah found hers in a cabin behind the great house, on a night in November, when the last thread of her humanity snapped, and she became something else entirely, something the planters of Mississippi could not afford to acknowledge existed in every slave quarter in the South. On the morning of December 7, 1861, Sarah was taken from her cell and transported by wagon to a field outside Vicksburg, where a gallows had been erected. The execution was public, as all slave executions were intended to be, a demonstration of power and a warning to others who might contemplate resistance. More than 500 people attended, including dozens of enslaved people who had been forced by their owners to witness the consequences of rebellion. Sarah walked to the gallows without assistance, her head high, her face calm. The Presbyterian minister, who had agreed to attend, Reverend Samuel Hutchins, offered to pray with her. She declined. He asked if she repented of her sins. She said she had committed no sin, that God would judge between her and the men she had killed, and that she expected a favorable verdict. Reverend Hutchins recoiled from her, crossing himself. though he was not Catholic, and later told his congregation that he had looked into the face of pure evil that morning and seen the devil's work in human form. The hanging itself was botched, as many were in that era. The drop was not calculated correctly for Sarah's weight, and her neck did not break cleanly. She strangled slowly at the end of the rope, while the crowd watched in silence, her body convulsing for several minutes before she finally went still. Some witnesses later reported that they heard singing from the group of enslaved people who had been forced to attend, a low spiritual that rose and fell like a wave, though others insisted the field was completely quiet. Sarah's body was cut down after 30 minutes and placed in a rough wooden coffin for transport to the medical college in Jackson. But something happened during that transport, something that was never fully explained. The wagon carrying her body was found abandoned on the road south of Vicksburg, the coffin open and empty. The driver vanished. An extensive search was conducted, but Sarah's body was never recovered. The driver, a free black man named Isaiah Cooper, was never found either, and speculation ran wild about what had happened, theories ranging from kidnapping by Northern abolitionists to supernatural intervention. The truth, whispered among the black community, but never acknowledged publicly, was that Sarah's body had been claimed by people who loved her, people who refused to let her final dignity be stripped away, people who buried her in an unmarked grave somewhere in the Mississippi Delta, where her bones rest to this day in peace. The Hartwell plantation was sold at auction in March of 1862 to settle the estate, which was considerable. The enslaved people were divided among several buyers, families separated, histories erased, names forgotten. Moses was purchased by a planter in Louisiana and died there 2 years later. Celia was sold downriver to New Orleans, where she worked in a hotel until emancipation. Thomas disappeared during the confusion of the Civil War and was never heard from again, though some claimed he made it to the Union lines and joined the colored troops. Young Samuel was sold to a cotton plantation in Arkansas and survived to old age, dying in 1903, one of the last people alive who had witnessed the events of Thanksgiving 1861. Before his death, he gave an interview to a black newspaper in Little Rock, and he spoke about Sarah with reverence, calling her the bravest person I ever knew, who chose death with freedom over life in chains. The great house itself burned to the ground in 1864 during Sherman's march to the sea, though Vicksburg was technically occupied by Union forces by that time, and the fire's origin was never determined. Some said it was an accident, sparks from a cooking fire that spread. Others insisted it was arson, enslaved people finally able to exact vengeance on the monuments to their oppression. By the end of the war, all that remained of the Hartwell plantation was the foundation stones of the great house and a series of crumbling cabins in the slave quarter, slowly being reclaimed by Kuzu and time. The land passed through several owners over the decades, none of them prosperous, none of them able to shake the sense that the ground itself was cursed. Today the property is part of a national park, the Vicksburg National Military Park, though no marker indicates what happened there in November of 1861. The park rangers who work there sometimes report odd occurrences in the area where the great house once stood, cold spots on hot summer days, the smell of wood smoke when no fires are burning, the sound of an axe striking wood in the dead of night. They do not speak of these things publicly, but they know the stories, passed down through generations, of the woman who refused to be broken. Sarah's story did not end with her death, or her disappearance, or the destruction of the plantation where she had lived and suffered. It lived on in the whispered conversations of enslaved people across the South, a story of resistance and retribution that terrified white planters and inspired those in bondage. It became a cautionary tale told by masters to their slaves, a warning about the consequences of violence, but it also became a different kind of story in the slave quarters, a tale of courage and refusal, of a woman who chose to die free rather than live in chains. After emancipation, when formerly enslaved people began to tell their own stories, Sarah's name appeared in dozens of narratives, always with respect, often with awe. sometimes with a kind of holy reverence. She became a folk hero in the black community of Mississippi, though her name was rarely spoken in white circles, and when it was with fear and discomfort. The broader truth that Sarah's story reveals is one that the South spent generations trying to obscure, a truth that white historians systematically excluded from textbooks and monuments and public memory. Slavery was not a paternalistic system of mutual obligation. It was not a civilizing force for an inferior race. It was a system of absolute power that corrupted absolutely, that turned human beings into property, and then expressed shock when that property refused to accept its status. Every plantation was a powder keg, every slave quarter a potential revolution, every moment of quiet obedience a choice rather than a given. The violence of slavery was not confined to the whip and the chain. It was psychological, spiritual, existential, a violence that sought to destroy the very humanity of those it enslaved. These histories matter not because they satisfy some morbid fascination with violence, but because they reveal the true cost of slavery, not just in economic terms or political terms, but in human terms. Every person enslaved was a Sarah, a potential rebel, a human being with thoughts and feelings and a breaking point. Every plantation was a Hartwell plantation, a site of ongoing trauma and suppressed violence. Every day that slavery continued was another day of accumulated sin, of moral corruption, of the destruction of souls both black and white. The men who owned slaves became monsters not because they were born evil, but because the system they inherited and defended required them to treat human beings as things, and that requirement poisoned everything it touched. The women and men who were enslaved became whatever they needed to become to survive, and sometimes, like Sarah, what they needed to become was the instrument of their own vengeance, the author of their own terrible freedom. When we excavate these stories, when we bring them out of the darkness where they have been hidden for over a century and a half, we are not celebrating violence or seeking revenge against long-dead oppressors. We are bearing witness. We are saying that these lives mattered, that these sufferings were real, that the system that caused them was evil, and that the legacy of that system continues to shape our world today. Sarah of Mississippi did not die to make us comfortable. She died because she refused to live as property, and her death, like her life, demands that we confront the hardest questions about power and freedom, and the price of both. The South preferred to forget stories like hers, to bury them along with the bodies in unmarked graves, to pretend that slavery was something other than what it was. But the truth does not stay buried. It rises like smoke from the ruins of burned plantations, like the sound of singing on execution grounds, like the memory of a woman with hazel eyes and a sharpened axe who decided that death with dignity was preferable to life without it. This is the story we tell at Shadows of the South, stories that make us uncomfortable, because they should make us uncomfortable, stories that reveal what human beings are capable of both inflicting and enduring, stories that remind us that the past is not past, that history has consequences, that silence is complicity. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think differently about the mythology of the antebellum South, if it has sparked in you a desire to know more uncomfortable truths, then share it, discuss it, let it do the work that Sarah's life and death demand it do. Comment below with your thoughts on how we remember these histories, on how we reckon with the legacy of slavery, on what we owe to those whose voices were silenced by violence and time. The conversation does not end here. It cannot end here, not while the consequences of what happened on plantations like Hartwell's continue to echo through our society, not while we still struggle to acknowledge the full truth of what slavery was and what it did to everyone it touched. Sarah's story is America's story, the part we tried to forget, the part we must remember if we are ever to understand ourselves.